So today on the show, I'm really happy to have with me a very successful serial entrepreneur and friend of mine, Brad Hargreaves. Brad is the founder of General Assembly. He's also the founder of Common, which at its peak, which is, I think it's at its peak now, 10,000 doors under management. And much more recently, the founder of the very thought-provoking online real estate magazine, Thesis Driven. So Brad, welcome to the show.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on today.
So, uh, before we get into all of your backstory, can you just tell everybody what thesis driven is if they don't already know?
So Thesis Driven is a real estate, started as a real estate newsletter, and that's still mostly what it is, focused on big thematic trends in real estate. So there's a lot of real estate media and information out there around this person bought this building from this person for this much. But we wanted something that would really take a step back and say, hey, in the next 12, 18, 36 months, what's going to happen to these various sectors that are undergoing transformation right now? What impact will technology have? What markets are interesting? And what are we going to see emerging that might be kind of on the fringes of investability today, but is going to really come into the mainstream over the next few years? So some of it I write. We also have a great slate of guest writers. We come out with these deep dives, usually twice a week, digging into various aspects of primarily commercial real estate. So it's great. We're pretty much top 10 business newsletter on Substack now. So it's been fun to see the growth after only doing it for about a year now.
So you didn't want to be like another essentially like industry gossip rag, like like the Real Deal or something like that. You wanted to kind of have a little more sort of meat to the content, a little more thought, sort of think pieces around this, right?
I'm just not cool enough. Like I would love to do what Hiten Samtani does. Now he started 1031, where he gets in all the cocktail parties and he'll hears all the gossip for what all the big players in commercial real estate are doing. I've got little kids. I'm just not that cool. I'm sitting at home going to bed at 9:30 on a Friday night. So I'm not out east. So I'm just not that cool. So all I can do is look at the data, talk to developers about what they're building, what's interesting, what are LPs excited about these days, given what's going on with rates and everything in the market, and write about that and try to just connect the dots and put some trends together.
And so what was the genesis of this? What led you to start it?
Yeah, so it was I can talk more about this, but about a year and a half ago, we hired a CEO to run Common, which is something I was very excited about doing. I'd been doing it for at the time about 7 years as CEO. Um, and that gave me a little bit of free time. And I said, hey, what have I wanted to do over the past 7 years that I haven't gotten a chance to do because I've just been too busy? And the main one was write. I really wanted, you saw a lot of what was going on. Rates were rising at the time. You had a lot of still post-pandemic changes happening, changes in the way people worked, changes in living patterns, changes in the way people traveled. And I wanted to write about all these things and what some of the effects coming out of those secular changes might be. So the first article I wrote was a deep dive into office to residential conversions. And rather than just doing it theoretically, I actually went and called up 3 or 4 developers that had actually done these, that had actually converted office buildings to residential. One of them was in the late 90s, one of them was 5 years ago. There were a handful of these, and said, how much did it cost? What were the challenges? What strategy did you take? What yield on cost were you targeting? How'd you find capital? And kind of dug into all these and got all this detail. And I was really honestly surprised how much they were willing to tell me, not just about how they did it, but by the financial returns they generated by doing it. And so I published it and it got a lot of interest, a lot of traction. Um, and then I was doing that for a while. Started adding more content, featuring some guest writers, uh, and realized that kind of there was a market for this kind of broader analysis of trends that were happening, and ideally, it's plugged into the broader narrative of what's going on in the world. So another popular article I did last summer, I dug into California Forever, which is a new city that is being proposed about 60 miles northeast of San Francisco. Um, and I really like dug into all of the plans they had published, analyzed it from kind of a real estate standpoint. Regular thesis driven readers know I have a low key obsession with new cities. So probably once every month or two, I write about like some kooky person building a new city, and sometimes they actually come to fruition. And I find that fascinating because I do believe there is this, we've gotten out of the habit of building wholly new places, and that maybe we should get back to that. So I wrote about that, and I just try to keep it interesting, and that every newsletter should cause people to, open their inbox and say, "Huh, wow, I hadn't heard of that before," and it gets them to think. And I think we've achieved that, and we're going to continue to push and continue to grow it.
So, gosh, I mean, there's a lot. It's going to be really fun kind of having this conversation with you because you'll answer a lot of questions I'm curious about. But, let's before we get into that though, is there anything like so far, you say you've been doing this for about a year. What has been really like the most fascinating thing that you've learned?
So I don't think I understood while I was at Common the breadth of interesting things and innovation in the industry. I mean, every day I get 3 to 5 emails from people just reaching out, whether intros or cold, saying, "Hey, Brad, I've got some land locked up over here. I'm building something really interesting and novel that you never would have thought about." So I'll give you an example. I got an email from a young woman 2 weeks ago. She's got some land outside of Houston, and she's building a Texas branded theme park, which evidently, the theme park in Houston went out of business 5 years ago, and it's the largest city in the US for which there is no theme park. So she's building this Texas branded theme park. And like, wow, I never would have thought about building theme parks in the theme park development industry. And how does that fit into real estate? What kind of LPs do you look for? What's your risk profile? How do you lock up land? How do you get entitlements? All of these questions. And not every developer, not every real estate investor is going to be interested in this. There are some I talk to who are just like, I just want to focus on my market, my business, and not read about the woman building a theme park outside Houston. But I don't know. I think a lot of people in real estate, and certainly we've seen this in terms of building our audience, actually are really creative and artistic people and want to know the menagerie of things going on out there, not just because it's interesting, because it's fun, but because it might inform what they're doing and give them some idea for their next project. Not that they're going to go build a theme park, but like, hey, is there some angle to that? Something you heard about, like maybe a way to approach investors, maybe a way to lock up a site, maybe like a really cool thing to put in place that's going to engage your end user. That's why people read it.
That reminds me of when I had an earlier version of this podcast, and I think that maybe it was the one that you were on, that was called Capital Gains. And it was a bit broader than this podcast because it was sort of about all sorts of alternative investments, but I did have a lot of real estate people on there. It was really interesting to me to find out what different kinds of things people were investing in, right? So like being able to like invest in, websites, or to be able to invest in like marinas, or at the time, RV parks were kind of exotic. I mean, now that they're run of the mill, but like there were just so many things that people were buying, art, or at the time also cannabis was like a new thing, but cannabis products. Like it wasn't just it was like all the whole penumbra of like things around cannabis that you could potentially invest in. I can see how that's really appealing to be able to kind of take like a really broad view of real estate and just dig into interesting things that you come across.
It absolutely is. And I look at it as kind of very adjacent to this broader world of, micro cap private equity, people buying really interesting little businesses. I mean, I have friends who, buy cash flowing websites. And, that's a totally different underwriting process. But when you
Right.
boil it down, you're buying it for a certain cap rate, and that cap rate is determined by, the predictability and growth rate of the cash flows over time, and the competitiveness of the process. So it's all kind of part and parcel of the same thing. And, I hybridize those a lot. So I had a great article that I was really proud of, at least last year, about classic car storage businesses. Now, I don't know. I don't know much about classic cars. I live in Manhattan. I don't own a car. But my father-in-law, who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, is a huge collector of classic cars. And he was telling me about some of these businesses that his friends have started, of these condo garages. I'd never heard of a condo garage. But what they do is they basically build a storage facility. It basically kind of looks like self-storage, but then they make it really cool and they turn it into a clubhouse. So it's not just a garage. I mean, some of these things have, bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchens, and they're basically like units above the garage where the classic car collectors can entertain. I guess they can sleep there overnight after they get in a fight with their significant other. I don't know how but and then they build these huge clubhouses, and these things become not self-storage businesses, but something completely different, where in many cases, a lot of the revenue is coming from these club membership fees, where it's a country club. People want to be a part of it. And they're just like, they're not into golf. They're into collectible and exotic cars. And there's some tremendous businesses out there. And, then you say, okay, well, this is what, a lot of these small investors have been doing. But hey, wait, the institutions are coming in. Now you've got Haggerty, a multi-billion-dollar insurance company, basically funding one of these membership clubs and putting a ton of capital into growing this nationwide. And it's a really interesting real estate opportunity. So I try to surface these interesting things and put the thread together so it doesn't read like a dry finance newsletter. It reads like the culture section of the New York Times. But at the end of the day, you learn something about a new real estate category.
I mean, it is really interesting how, I don't know if you're maybe familiar with James Altucher, right? And he has this concept of idea sex, right? Where you take two ideas that are seemingly from like really disparate areas and you mash them up together and you come up with something really interesting. I mean, it seems like, well, first of all, some of these ideas are very much that, right? They are kind of a mashup of stuff, but I think also what's appealing about what you're doing, you alluded to this earlier, that it allows you to then do some of your own idea sex where you see this interesting model and you're like, huh, I wonder if that will work over here. And that's
right.
And you never would have thought about it if you hadn't written that article or read that article, right? So I just think it's always a good, I find a lot of people in real estate are very siloed and they're very focused on just the thing they do and they don't want to do anything else, or maybe they'll, okay, self-storage looks kind of like multifamily, so I'll go do self-storage too. But there's a lot of reluctance to really think outside the box, so to speak. But I think this is really a great opportunity to kind of apply different business principles, different ideas to something, that can be kind of mundane,
Yeah, I mean, I like applying the cocktail party test a lot because, look, you're a value add multifamily investor, let's say. 99% of your focus and attention and waking hours should be focused on value add multifamily. Maybe you add one category to that. Maybe you add another market, something like that. But it's actually not great to be a general, like a true generalist the way I am. I mean, I write a real estate finance newsletter. I can be a generalist, but most people should be specialists. So what I think about in terms of creating what we're doing at Thesis Driven is to allow specialists to be generalists, at least when it comes to standing at the cocktail party and someone says, let's talk about self-storage. Let's talk about membership clubs. Let's talk. I don't know what kind of cocktail parties you're going to, but like, sometimes you're at an industry event and a different topic comes up. And that fluency, I think, is really important because if you're a sponsor and you're standing with an LP and the LP is like, oh, wow, I just met a really interesting guy doing office to residential conversions. It's actually helpful to be able to talk intelligently about office to residential conversions, even if it's not something you've done personally. So that cocktail party fluency is something we pride ourselves on in terms of what we're writing and the standard we write to.
Well, I mean, listen, and that you say that in a little bit of a like self-deprecating way, but I mean, I think that's really important, right? I mean, because look, if you are out there talking to investors, like at the end of the day, people are not going to invest with you if they don't form some kind of personal connection with you, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's that sort of thing that makes you stand out, makes you interesting, or also makes them feel like, wow, this person is really thinking about stuff. They're thinking about it in a different way. Therefore, I trust them more because I feel like they're a thoughtful person. So I think having your fingertips on this kind of information is very powerful.
100% agreed. It is about personal connection. People don't want to get in business with someone who doesn't have a broad sense of what's going on in the world. I believe that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely with that. But I wanted to, you just mentioned to office to residential conversions again. So I would love to ask you sort of what you have learned about this, because obviously this is a really topical and important topic these days. I have some thoughts about it, but I would love for you to kind of, talk about what you've learned and where you see this going based on what you've learned.
Yeah, so there's been one reason I wrote about it is there's just been a tremendous amount of attention placed on office to residential conversions over the past 3 years since the pandemic. And the biggest issue I saw with the dialogue is that it's all very theoretical. You have architects talking about it very theoretically. You have politicians talking about it at 50,000 feet. But no one was really asking the developers who had done it, what do you look for? How do you do it? And what are some of the challenges and barriers that are in place that's preventing it from becoming the norm? And look, more of these are happening. You are seeing, I would say, dozens moving into hundreds of office buildings undergoing this kind of conversion right now, would be my estimate. And there's a few categories where they make sense. So let's look at the barriers first of all. Number one barrier is it's expensive. This is real construction. I mean, these office buildings do not typically have the plumbing, the HVAC, the electrical that you need for multifamily. So you're blowing holes in the floors and you're doing more runs up these buildings, which is a big cost driver. So that's one. It's very expensive. Two is the floor plate of many offices does not work very well for multifamily. Office floor plates tend to be very deep. They tend to have this big unlit core. I mean, think about your prototypical office. The executives have the windowed offices in the conference rooms or have the window space at the periphery. At the core, you have the elevator bank. And then you have a big unlit section, or without natural light at least, where, most people work in cubicles. That does not work for multifamily. Multifamily, you need windows. I mean, in most jurisdictions, every room needs natural light and air. That the office buildings are not set up for that. So there's a few solutions to it. One is you pick office buildings that have a footprint that works well for multifamily. A lot of office buildings built prior to, say, 1950 tend to be a lot thinner. And many of them have setbacks. So if you
Right.
look at your standard like 1930s, 1920s office building, one, it's on a much smaller footprint. And two, there's multiple setbacks as you go up the building. So what you see some developers do is they'll keep, say, the bottom 5 floors as office. Those are the thick, deep floor plates. And then floors 6 through 20 get converted into multifamily. Those are thinner floor plates. Those also have better views, and they're going to rent for more per square foot. So you're seeing some of those hybrid conversions too. The other place where it makes sense is incredibly high rent market, especially markets that have been downzoned. One market that fits both those criteria, New York City. So you see a lot of these office to residential conversions that have been underway for quite a while in New York City. Nathan Berman in Metroloft has probably done more office conversions than anyone in the world, I would say. He's been doing them since the 1990s in New York City. And New York was downzoned in 1961. So any building built before 1961 is probably overbuilt, which is there's more square footage there than you would be able to build today. So there's a big reason, there's a big carrot to not just demolishing whatever is there today, but rather reusing it and keeping that square footage. It's also very high price per square foot market. Not rare for a new build condo in New York City to fetch 2,500 to 3,000 per foot. So that gives you a lot of wiggle room to do weird construction things. So Nathan's hallmark is he'll actually blow a corridor, a light well in the middle of the building in order to get light and air into the units. Now that's kind of crazy, but he doesn't. He makes it work because of New York City's unique situation.
If you live in New York City, you've probably been in a converted office one time or another, right? So
Yes.
I've been in a number of these buildings, like visiting friends who live there. And I do remember going into one that had formerly been a trading floor on Wall Street. So they had apartments all around the periphery, and in the middle was just this big sort of empty space, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it made sense because they were able to rent it out at such a that just to leave all that square footage unused. But it's always thinking about that apartment, that building now, this is 20 years later, it seems to me that there's a lot of things that you could do with that space. That, for instance, you don't necessarily need to have light and air in a kitchen, right? I mean, I've lived in apartments in New York that have the kitchens are always buried on the interior. There are no windows there. So you can build that way in bathrooms too. But in terms of that space, like that space between the apartments, it seems to me there's a lot of things that could be funky. You could put a pickleball court there. You could put you could put a lounge out there for actually the neighbors to sit out there and greet each other and get to know
Yeah.
each other, which is different from most apartment buildings. So have you come across any sort of creative uses for those spaces when you've been talking with people?
Well, I mean, that's what WeLive tried to do. WeLive was WeWork's apartment concept. They did a couple of these conversions. They did one in at 110 Wall in New York, and they did another in Crystal City in Virginia. Interestingly, that Common manages today. And they basically use the unlit core as amenity space. They had shared laundry facilities, they had lounges, they had shared kitchens, things like that. The challenge is there's only so many of those spaces you can build, and it's a tremendous amount of square footage in a lot of these buildings. Now, one thing that would go a long way to that I advocate for, that would go a long way to helping use this space is legalizing shared light bedrooms. So allowing apartments to build bedrooms that have a transom window but not a full window to the outside. This is a big issue and is actually really nice to have if you have little kids. Um, little kids don't necessarily need windows. Living in New York City while our house was under development, our younger child lived in a walk-in closet for about a year. So it's I'm a big advocate of some of those regulatory changes that can make some of this easier, um, and open up more of these conversions that currently are pretty marginal.
And so where does this not work? Right. So you mentioned a couple of factors that make it work in New York City. What are the kind of things that maybe work against this in other places?
So the sad part is a lot of the offices that are having the worst trouble are also the places where this kind of conversion doesn't work. So you think, your traditional low rise 1980s, 1990s build suburban office park cannot be converted to residential. It does not make sense. Rents in the suburbs are generally much lower, so the cost doesn't make sense. Those floor plates tend to be very, very wide, and you just have a design element that, like, it's very hard to make your typical suburban office not look and feel like a suburban office. So some of those, I mean, I am a fan of some of the models like Serendipity Labs, obviously Industrious, that are creating kind of small format managed office, flex office models in suburban locations where, a lot of these suburbs, that's where the workers live. They don't want to come into the central business district every day. They want to stay out in the suburbs, but they like this idea of, 2, 3 days a week coming into a shared space. So there are companies that are facilitating that are actually doing quite well and bucking the trend of suburban office decline. So I like that for suburban offices, but frankly, there's too much mid suburban office square footage right now. And a lot of it is just sadly going to go away. And some of it will get scraped and turned into apartment buildings, parks, retail, what have you. But unfortunately, a lot of the existing structures cannot easily be repurposed.
And what about high rises in cities that are not as expensive as New York, or are central business districts everywhere expensive enough that conversion makes sense?
I wish I could say they were, but they're not. New York, at least, and I would say a lot of other, gateway cities, um, has a has room for rents to fall and buildings to still cover their operating cost and have a reason to exist. Now that's separate from the question of, is residential a higher and better use? But let's put that to the side for a second because that's a complicated question. Let's just ask the question of, okay, a lot of these buildings, the equity is going to get wiped. The lender's going to take the keys. They're going to sell it to somebody else. It's not fine if you're an office owner, but like for cities, that's fine. Rents will drop unless rents do not cover operating costs. And then we have a real problem. And I think in New York, it's fine. Major coastal cities, fine. I think where you are going to have an issue are Midwestern cities, Rust Belt cities, and some very overbuilt Sun Belt markets where these rents, office rents, may not even cover the cost to run the building. And that is where you're really going to start seeing problems and seeing real distress.
And then what do you think happens to those buildings? I mean, if you see, I'm sure that you're familiar with, you know, office buildings in the Rust Belt that have just been vacant
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
decades, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
and ironically enough, now some of them are being like some well-known properties like in Buffalo and other places are now after decades being converted into housing, which is very interesting. But I mean, what is the future of like a city block wide square glass office tower in Houston in like a like not a terrific area for living?
I mean, I would say that the answer to that is subsidiary to the question, what happens to those cities?
Yeah.
Like, if your central business district office rents can't cover your office operating expenses, what's like, that's a existential issue for the city. And how does that city not become another Flint?
Mm.
And I think that's a question we have to grapple with as a country and look to examples of cities like Pittsburgh, like Rochester, that have actually started to turn the corner here and like really invested in reclaiming their downtowns from cars. It's pretty important.
Mm.
That have invested in eds and meds, companies, industries that bring wealth to the city and that have some competitive edge, some differentiation. I mean, Pittsburgh being a hub for robotics and artificial intelligence is a massive tailwind and why that city has bucked the trend of a lot of its peers in the region. But it's an existential issue for a lot of American cities that have relied on their central business districts. But I would say this is a policy issue at the core. And a lot of these cities get in their own ways. You look at a place that is struggling, and you're like, well, surely they have a zoning code that is very encouraging of development and accommodating to whatever use you want to bring in if you're willing to make an investment. And they never do. Their zoning codes are almost uniformly some of the worst out there. Similarly, I mean, a lot of these cities, unfortunately, back in the 1960s, back in the 1970s, were cut in half, cut in quarters by interstate highways.
Yeah.
Interstate highways that now really aren't used. These cities don't have traffic problems. They have the opposite of traffic problems. So reclaiming some of that land from highways, from cars, creating walkable cores like those cities had in the first half of the 20th century and the 19th century at their heights, that's where they need to move.
It's interesting. I have noticed several cities, primarily down south, that missed out on having their downtowns destroyed in order to save them because they were thought to be beyond saving. Like, so a place like Savannah, Georgia, or Greenville, South Carolina,
Yep.
or places like that where the bottom just dropped out of those cities, and it didn't even make sense to tear down the beautiful old city downtown to put in parking lots.
Right.
They've all benefited from the fact that they still have their beautiful downtowns, unlike a lot of these other cities, which like really hastily kind of destroyed their downtowns to make it easier for people from the suburbs to get into the cities. And now they're really kind of screwed, right? Because there's no reason to go there. And if you're not working, right? So
100%. I mean, I saw this with the town my parents live in, Shreveport, Louisiana. Cut in halves and into thirds by I-20 and I-49. And the crazy part is now they're actually doing it again. They're about to bulldoze a neighborhood in Shreveport, Louisiana to extend I-49. And the fact that we're still doing this in year of our Lord 2024 boggles my mind.
So what kind of policy changes do you think that cities should make? Obviously, probably not building highways right through them is one I would suspect that you would think is a good idea. But what are some of the others that you think will help cities turn around?
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned zoning reform. I would say that is far and away the biggest thing these cities can do in their downtowns. Just get out of their own way.
Meaning what exactly? Just get rid of zoning, or what's? No, I'm serious. I'm curious to what zoning reform would actually mean.
Well, I think abolishing zoning entirely would be better than what they have today. I do think there is a middle ground that's probably optimal, where you are still separating incompatible uses, while at the same time having and still protecting historic neighborhoods, while still giving a pretty broad breadth of basically allowing anyone who's coming in and saying, hey, I'm willing to invest in this place to do something innovative and creative, not being too prescriptive with exactly what they want where, but saying, hey, we have, you know, this, 2 square miles of area next to our downtown that has great walkable bones, but has suffered from disinvestment for 60, 70 years. We want people to come in. We're going to give, whether it's zoning relief, tax abatements, whatever, to people who are willing to come in and invest and build in this area, build in this neighborhood. And I believe that you are going to see a renaissance in the cities that embrace this kind of liberalization of zoning in their walkable downtown cores. There's a massive shortage of walkable neighborhoods in America right now because we're not really making any more. It's kind of illegal to make. And so you think about where there are walkable neighborhoods in the US today that are not priced at $5 a foot and above per month rents, and they're pretty much all in the Rust Belt. Handful of southern cities as well, but they're pretty much all in the Rust Belt. And so if I were one of these mayors of a town in the Finger Lakes, in Ohio, in Michigan, and I had a great little walkable downtown and affordable rents, which pretty much all of them do, I would think really hard about how I unlock that.
It's funny you mentioned that because the other day I was thinking, especially particularly in the context of the Finger Lakes, there are some very attractive towns there. A lot of them have come back mostly due to tourism, but I don't know of any of them that are promoting themselves as a destination for remote workers on the basis that, hey, look, we have a walkable downtown. You can buy a house very cheaply right downtown here and walk to all the stuff. You can walk to the market, you can walk to the bar, you can walk to the coffee shop, you can walk to the restaurants, you can walk to the school. It's all right here. So many of the suburban, the people who left the cities because of work for home moved to the suburbs and they hate it because they can't walk anywhere, right? And now they all want to come back and they can't afford to move back to the cities, so they're sort of stuck. Right. And it seems like a lot of these small towns have not really understood yet what they have that wowould appeal to those people who want that walkability, don't want to be stuck in a sort of place where you can't get, you have to drive everywhere if they're remote anyway, right? So you're seeing any trends along that? Is anybody noticing this yet? Or
no, it's almost always though led by the private sector first. Investors, developers, individuals coming in, buying homes, renovating them, building new small multifamily. A lot of the political class is still of a generation that hasn't updated its worldview that people want to live in downtown. That, downtown is not a sad, economically depressed area that needs to be, alternately subsidized or fenced off, but is instead something incredibly desirable, a place people want to go, a draw. And that's beginning to change. It's absolutely beginning to change. And you're seeing, cities that 10 years ago were the worst of the worst, places like Detroit, that really seemed hopeless, say, hey, we are going to, and this is going to be a painful process, but we're actually going to abandon a lot of the periphery and focus on a really small core. But that core is going to be really nice, and it's going to be a place people want to be. And that's been a really tough process, but it's kind of necessary.
Right. And it will grow, though. That's the thing. If you get the core right, then it'll expand back out to the periphery. So I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but you mentioned, that you also have developed a fascination with new cities. Yes. And so, in the context of, we've been talking a lot about cities. This went in a very different direction than I thought, but this is great. So we've been talking about sort of older cities, legacy cities, some of the things that they've done right or wrong or accidentally gotten right. Um, Looking at the new cities, my impression of a new city has always been, well, some like, arrogant person or government comes in and says they're going to build a perfect city, and what they wind up with is something really sterile that
Yes.
that nobody wants to be in, and it's a complete and utter failure. So are these new cities going in that same direction, or have they learned the lesson and of those past examples? Maybe some have, maybe some haven't. I'm just really curious sort of what you're seeing out there in this aspect.
Yeah, I think we're in a fascinating moment right now in terms of the development in new cities. So let's just focus on what's happening in the United States. A lot of really interesting things happening outside the United States, but that could be a whole podcast. Within the United States, you really have the new urbanist movement has taken hold among anyone thinking about building new cities. And this is, you look at new urbanism and it basically says we need to go back to the way we built cities in the 19th century. So build them focused on people, focused on walkability, mixed use. So it's not segregated residential over here, strip mall over here. Build them with real density as well. So everything should be, at least in the core, at least 2 or 3 stories. Not crazy density, not New York City, but 2 stories going up to 5 stories, say. So you see the people who are being successful right now building cities are embracing that mindset. I did a profile a couple months ago on Casey Roloff, one of my favorite real estate entrepreneurs. He was a home builder in the Pacific Northwest who visited Seaside, Florida, which is one of the first new urbanist communities. It's where the Truman Show was filmed, actually, and said we need to do kind of a more organic version of this on the Pacific coast. And so he bought a few hundred acres, about 3 hours outside of Seattle on the Pacific coast. And over the past 20 years has built one of the most interesting new cities in the US called Seabrook. Now it's a vacation town. I don't think there's a lot of industry or non-service jobs in Seabrook, but it has a few thousand residents now. And it's a really beautiful and idyllic place. And he's embraced a lot of these principles to make it, yes, it is planned, but it also feels very natural. It feels like a beautiful seaside town, that you would encounter that's been around for 100 years. So I'm a believer that like we need to be creating beautiful, well-designed spaces. And I like what Casey's doing. I think I mentioned California Forever was is this project. They've raised about $1 billion from Silicon Valley investors, bought 50,000 acres of land in Solano County, northeast of San Francisco. They have a big ballot measure coming up where their city has to be approved by a majority of Solano County residents. That election is in November. Will be really interesting and a bit of a referendum on the concept of new cities to see whether that is embraced by the locals who see the economic benefits outweighing the risks.
Is that city meant to be dense, or is that going to be more suburban? I mean, what is it supposed to look like? And is it mixed use throughout, or is it sort of central business district with houses around it? I mean, I've heard of this project, but I really don't know anything about it.
Yeah, so they came out with detailed plans kind of at the end of January 2024. And I think they're really good. It's a very, very dense city center, a ton of open space. So with density, you can actually preserve open space and get the same number of people. So if you have kind of a dense city center, you can have a lot more open space where people can, whether it's reserved for farming, whether people can just enjoy it, parkland, whatever. So they've preserved the vast majority, I think like 80% of their 50,000 acres. They've preserved that. They're not building there. And then they've taken 10,000 of those acres or so and said, this is where our city is going to be. And it's not going to be your typical, single family tract home development, but we are going to have a dense urban core, that rivals the densities of, parts of San Francisco and Los Angeles. That then kind of grades out to, small lot, single family. and then to parkland. And I think that's the right way to do it. And I think the big question for them is going to be who's after the ballot is going to be who's living there. Are they remote workers? Are they retirees? Is it second homeowners? So who's out there buying those houses? Who's renting property out there? And then, if they have to get into San Francisco, what's the transit look like? I mean, there's no rail line there. So that's going to be another question for them.
Yeah, and what do these new cities do about cars, right? Because obviously people are not going to give up their cars, but if the point is this is supposed to be walkable, I mean, I've seen some of these sort of smaller new urbanist developments, and often I haven't seen a lot, so I'll be fair. I've seen a couple of them, and they've left me a little bit flat because it's sort of like they're still organized around the car, even though there's sort of 2 blocks downtown where you can walk to stuff, but it all seems then you kind of peek around the corner and it's all just kind of like
It's all parking lots.
It's all parking, right? And so it sort of seems like a mall except it's houses, right? And
right.
And do you know what are these hopefully sort of more innovative projects? How are they approaching this?
Yeah, well, I think what California Forever is doing actually has the scale to sort of change these dynamics of, you don't need a car to live there. You could, there's going to be, I assume, some pool of shared cars or something like that. And if you need to go into San Francisco once or twice a week, you can pick one of those up. So even if you push the cars per household from, 1.5 down to 0.9, that's a massive difference in terms of how much parking you need and can really change the feel of the built environment. If rather than having 5 parking spots for every resident, you have 1 parking spot for every resident. That's a dramatic change in how you're using the urban fabric. And you even look in a place like New York City, still crazy amounts of land dedicated to parking. Obviously, New York City is still walkable. The city does a great job of hiding at least some of the parking. So I do believe there's ways that cars can coexist in these communities, but it's tough when it's a bolt-on to an existing metro area. Right. I think you have to really do it from scratch to change that math.
Well, we've kind of run out of time, but I just wanted to know if there's anything that we didn't touch on that we should have in this conversation.
Look, really encourage people to check out Thesis Driven. We're at thesisdriven.com. As I mentioned, we put out newsletters a week. We just launched the Thesis Driven Leader Series, which is actually a set of live conversations with leaders kind of at the intersection of tech and real estate and innovation. So encourage people to check that out. Otherwise, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fascinating conversation, and I would love to bring you back just to talk about how it's going. And also, we never did get to the story of Common, which is a great story on its own. So I'll leave that cliffhanger for people to tune in for next time. But I really encourage everybody to subscribe to Thesis Driven. It's really, really well done, fascinating conversations. And Brad, great catching up with you, and thanks for being on the show today.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on.